Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by NSTA, the National Science Teaching Association. Find out more about what NSTA has to offer at nsta.org. You're listening to Lab Out Loud, Science for the Classroom and beyond. And in this episode, our guest is a master of using the story form to emphasize the human side of science, both good and bad.
We just remember things better when it's presented in a story form. It's the way the human brain works. We're bad with disconnected facts, but we're very good with stories. So if we can talk about, heroic stories in science, that gets people excited about science. It gets them to enjoy it, gets them to trust science. I think that can help. The same, by the same token, with the bad things that scientists have done, and I do think the good far outweighs the bad, but I think we should have an honest reckoning with the bad things that have been done in the name of science.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first I'm your co-host Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartell.
And we are back for Lab Out Loud, Season 15, Episode 249.
Season 15.
That's right, Season 15 of Lab Out Loud. Our seasons start with the new school year, like most new school years in the U.S., kind of start in the fall. Not everybody, but many do. Us, Brian and I, actually, we haven't started yet, but I do understand that lots of our listeners maybe already had a couple weeks of school already, and we will be right there with you in about a week.
We actually start before Labor Day, but usually we start after. So, but Labor Day is a little later, so we're in good shape this way. We do start in September, but right. So August, a few of you are back already. Many of you are back already. I've seen a lot of back to school pictures posted already, but so we hope that you are enjoying a new year with new challenges, and I hope you don't have to hear words like pivot and, all these things that we kind of dreaded from the last couple of years. And I do hope we hear more things like vaccine in a positive way and all that kind of thing.
Yes. Well, I definitely think that this start of the school year is another new challenge for teachers, for students, parents, everyone, because we're still kind of struggling with the changes with the pandemic and those kinds of things. But I think this year we have the advantage of a little bit of looking back and seeing what we found valuable last year when maybe our schools were virtual, and what pieces can we go back to the way we were doing it pre-pandemic, but what pieces from the pandemic can we bring along? And so you're always kind of taking that look back at your work and seeing what kind of changes you can make, hopefully to keep up with the times and make things better overall. And I think we've tried to do that for this podcast too.
We have. And, we've been doing this for 15 years this way to provide a resource for you that you can access whenever you want. And please let us know what else should we tackle? What kind of topics do you want us to cover? We've branched out. We've tried a few different things here and there, and we're open to hearing from you. Make sure you leave a comment on the website. There's a place to connect with us there. Leave a review on iTunes or on whatever your podcast catcher is, and let us know what are some things that you want us to talk about. What kind of things would you like to hear about in your ears?
And with that, let's get started with our guest for this episode. He's back on our show for the fourth time to talk to us. He's an author. Here he is. We're going to be talking about his brand new book and his podcast.
I'm Sam Kean. I am a writer and podcaster, and my most recent book is called The Icepick Surgeon.
Now, podcaster was a new surprise. How long have you been doing that?
It's been a little over a year now. I had kind of had the plans in the works, and then when the pandemic hit, I had been kind of recording a few episodes and just decided, I'm going to jump in and just send them out there and see what happens. But it's been a lot of fun. Yeah. With my books, those tend to have kind of a common theme to them, where every story in there relates back to a common theme. But when I'm doing my research, I come across really great, really interesting stories all the time that I want to tell, I want to do something with, but that maybe just don't fit within the themes of the book. So sure. The podcast has been a really nice way to get those stories out there and have a little bit of fun with them and kind of tell the stories in a different medium. So I've really enjoyed doing it.
And they're nice length too. They're not too long, not too short, and kind of get you into stories. Make me want to kind of learn more about those stories too. So it's called The Disappearing Spoon, which is the title of. Is that your first book?
That was my first book, yeah. So I'm using that same title, The Disappearing Spoon. And you're right. I try to keep it at about 17 to 20 minutes or so easily digestible, usually focused on a little interesting tidbit or a character from history, science, something like that. Yeah.
Is that about a chapter length?
No, these are about probably 2,000 to 2,500 words, and a chapter would run 7,000 or so. So not quite.
Oh, okay.
I have, you mentioned that you kind of during the pandemic. So the first episode I listened to was one about live vaccines. And my wife and I and the kids were going somewhere in the car, and we're listening to this. Sam, every one of your podcast episodes, and almost like chapters in your book too, there's a point where you're like, what? Wait, what happened? And the vaccine one, I think, is a remarkable story about these children. Could you tell us a little bit about that? I think it's sort of vaccine related. We're in the vaccine world right now.
Yeah, and that's good to hear, because I think that's the reaction I'm looking for when I'm digging into a story. When I think, what? I can't believe that happened. And so that's good that it comes across, because that's kind of the motivating factor for me. This story about the vaccines you're mentioning sort of derived from, as you said, as we're obviously all in the vaccine world right now. I knew of the story of Edward Jenner and the smallpox vaccine that he helped develop. And so that's kind of a famous, well-known story. But I started wondering, that was back in the late 1700s, early 1800s. How did they actually get the vaccines to other towns, to other continents? How did they actually spread the vaccine around when they didn't have planes, when they didn't have refrigeration? So I started looking into it a little bit and found this wild story about when they were trying to bring it to the Americas, especially to Spanish colonies in Mexico and all of South America. The Spanish crown essentially decided that the best way to get the vaccine across the ocean would be to use orphan children as sort of the carriers for this vaccine. The reason why is that the virus, when they were trying to spread it around, was very fragile. It can't live outside the human body for very long. And within Europe, it was possible to get it from, small town to small town with various methods. But even you would travel from London to Paris sometimes, the virus would die. It was not hardy enough to make it. So going across a whole ocean was often impossible. The only way they had to keep it alive was in human beings. And again, the Spanish crown decided that they were going to take some orphans, ages 3 to 9, infect them with the infect them with the cowpox.
Yeah.
And basically do it 2 by 2, so that you would give it to 2 of the small boys. They would develop the pustules. They'd maybe be at sea for a week or 2. And then right before the pustules on their arms with the fluid in it were about to go away, they would take it, they would lance those, and then give it to the next boys. And so you'd go 2 by 2 in a chain, essentially. And by the time they got to the Americas across the ocean, the very last boys in the chain would have nice, ripe pustules that they could take and start vaccinating people in the Americas. And obviously, it's not something we would do nowadays, but it did end up working. And they were able to vaccinate an incredible number of people in Mexico and South America. By some measures, millions and millions of people. And that's on top of all the people that were prevented getting it from outbreaks that would have occurred. So this arguably saved many, many lives. But again, ethically, it was a little dubious.
Yeah. Well, we didn't have the bloodborne pathogen course to take, so you free up a lot of other paperwork and things like that when you don't have those requirements.
It wasn't much paperwork involved in this one, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. Your stories do such a good job of kind of getting you into the human element of that scenario, because like what you just described is, how we pass that cowpox along. But then you kind of get us into the mindset. First of all, these kids are like, I want to say 3, 5, that young.
They were as young as 3, ages 3 to 9 was the range. But yeah, I mean, I just think about, a 3-year-old on a ship on the ocean, You can't. One thing they were not allowed to do is they were not allowed to scratch the pustules on their arms, even though it's very, very itchy, this cowpox. But they were not allowed to scratch it because that would spill the fluid. So imagine you've taken a 3-year-old from an orphanage, the only home it's ever known, has no mother, has no father. It's on a ship in the middle of the cold Atlantic. It has a sore on its arm. It can't scratch it. And just imagine trying to deal with that. Yeah. And yeah, I do try to put people in the mind of someone in that situation because I really think it brings out what the human side of science is like.
Yeah, I think there was like a woman that was a caretaker or something that you kind of described, and I was just like, oh, thinking about going back to the elementary schools in a month or so.
Yeah, Isabel Zendal Gomez, I think was her name, and she was actually the only woman on the journey. They had the ship's crew, which were all males. They had several male doctors, and all the boys were, or also all the orphans were boys as well. She was the only woman who made the trip, but she was really an essential part of this trip because she was the caretaker. She was the one making sure the boys were well fed, that they were not, panicking, and that they were basically able to be participants in this.
Crazy. We have obviously seen some of these ethical stories, I guess, take root in some of your other works too. I mean, even from Disappearing Spoon all the way through The Bastard Brigade and in between. Were you kind of like pulling those aside and say, oh, I got to come back to this, and hence now you have a book for it?
Yeah, I had been sort of gathering string, so to speak, for a while, where I'd always been interested in these cases of scientists who went rogue, who did something that they really shouldn't have in the name of science. And I'd included a couple cases, as you said, in Disappearing Spoon. There was one in my book, The Violinist's Thumb, about genetics. That was an awful case. But eventually I just decided I wanted to tackle this in a book by itself, just looking at cases like the Icepick Surgeon, where people were so obsessed with some topic or idea that they took it way too far, and in fact often committed crimes in the name of science. And we usually think about the pursuit of knowledge as a good thing. It drives scientists, helps them to understand how the world works. That's a good thing usually. But in some cases, again, they get so obsessed that everything else falls by the wayside, including ethics, and that pursuit of knowledge becomes a dark thing. And so that combination of the good and the evil there was kind of fascinating to me.
Do we not address that enough in like our historical kind of like teaching of how science is done? Is that brushed under the table, or is that just not even? I guess some of these stories that you're putting out there are very common stories that some of we've known about, but we don't know necessarily the other side of things.
Yeah. I think we're getting better in that I think scientists, especially in medical fields, are more aware of the ethical issues and more willing to take those things into account. I think the problem is that when you're, say, getting your PhD or something, there's just so much information you have to learn. Science is so hard nowadays. There's so much to absorb that in the course curriculum, they don't think there's time for that kind of stuff, that they just have to get the technical material out there. But I think one thing I did try to emphasize in the book is that in many cases, when you're doing unethical science, it's sort of ipso facto is bad science on top of that. So in a lot of cases, when we end up sacrificing our morals for scientific progress, we end up with neither one of those things. So I think it's probably best to maybe, set a bit of the technical stuff aside and address those issues, because I think that'll make for better science in the long run.
Do we need to teach that more explicitly in K-12 and post-secondary education?
Yeah, I think that it should definitely be a part of it. I don't think we need to focus just exclusively, say, on all the bad things that scientists done. We can talk about the heroic things they've done too. I think I would kind of broaden that and say that I think we need to emphasize the human side of science for a couple of reasons. The most important one being that we just remember things better when it's presented in a story form. That's the way the human brain works. We're bad with disconnected facts, but we're very good with stories. So if we can talk about, heroic stories in science, that gets people excited about science. It gets them to enjoy it, gets them to trust science. I think that can help. The same, by the same token, with the bad things that scientists have done, and I do think the good far outweighs the bad, but I think we should have an honest reckoning with the bad things that have been done in the name of science. And it's one thing to sort of hit a list of bullet points and say, don't do this, and, maybe give a sentence or two. It's a much different thing to, again, tell a story because you're immersed in that. You're feeling the emotions the person has. And when things go bad, you feel that gut punch in a way that you don't when it's just sort of disconnected bullet points. So I think telling those stories is a good thing to do. And it's one of the things I was trying to do with the book is to present things in that story form that will have, I think, more impact.
Yeah, the book is The Icepick Surgeon. I don't think we actually mentioned that yet, but we're talking about your newest book, The Icepick Surgeon. I'm a few chapters into it, and one chapter that spoke to me, especially amidst current events, is chapter 2 on basically the scientific endeavors and collections that piggybacked on top of the slave trade. Mm-hmm. And one thing I really appreciate is that you don't necessarily give an answer to how should we view some of this, but you do really push the reader to think about it and to question that. Like I think a good ethics professor might not give you the answer, but ethics are a part of what the society holds them to be, and so you give us the information to start thinking about it a little bit more richly and deeply.
Yeah, I really did want to make sure I wasn't just kind of pushing what I think about and the way I think about these issues onto people. I definitely want to present that side, but also kind of present the other side as well. And the slavery chapter was one that I felt was important because it's a larger conversation the society is having. People are talking about, the deep, long history, different things like that. And I'd been reading some things from some academics, historians, that was really talking about the roots of science and how it was really tied up in the slave trade. And it's more of a general issue in that so much of society and the economy was tied up in the slave trade that science was not exempt from this.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I just talk about how science was integrated into society, how it benefited in a lot of cases from the slave trade, usually indirectly, but there were cases out there where it was a little bit more blatant and direct, and I just wanted to present those stories and just kind of get people thinking and talking about those things.
And as you mentioned in this is chapter 2 here, that some of the characters that you wrote about did have some internal battles with it, but some of those slowly just kind of dissolved as their own morals kind of got chewed away.
Yeah. One story you're probably talking about that I mentioned is a man named Henry Smithman, who was a naturalist. He wanted to work in places like Africa and South America. But he realized he came from a very poor background, didn't have much money, and he realized that the only practical way he could get to these places was by hitching a ride on ships that were bringing slaves, that were bringing goods to slave markets. When he got there, the only way he could get to other islands was to hitch rides with slave ships. And he actually went down there as a committed abolitionist. He wanted to get rid of slavery, but his desire to be a naturalist and kind of win fame for himself eventually eroded him step by step, and he found himself, gradually but sort of inexorably compromising his morals, and ended up, even by the end, dabbling in trading slaves himself. So you see him do almost a complete 180 where he gave up his convictions in order to promote his science and sort of got tied up in this nasty, awful slaving trade.
I want to hear these stories because I find them very interesting. Not only are they, they're interesting stories, but they also present scientists in, again, a human light. Like, these are people. They wrestle with these issues. They make mistakes. They make the wrong call. They go down the wrong path. I think about a listener who is concerned about, particularly discussions like in a K-12 classroom about the conspiracy natures of things, like the distrust of science. We face that as science teachers with discussions around evolutionary biology and climate change and history of the earth and vaccine discussions and things like that. So if there are members of the population that are seeking out places to see a lineage of bad scientists, how do we kind of watch for that and correct for that too?
I mean, it's hard. I don't think there's one good, quick solution to it. I think one thing to do is, again, sort of keep these ethical stories in mind and make sure we're actively talking, debating, discussing these issues. But at one point in the book, I do talk about the fact that there are certain things that we can do. I call it sort of using good science to fight bad science, in that psychologists have looked at things like group dynamics, group decision-making, and have seen cases where people ended up making horrible decisions, where they kind of went off the rails. What were the common denominators in those groups? What things ended up helping them? What things ended up not helping them? Stuff like that. So I do talk about some of those instances in the book. Things like having a very homogenous background. People often feel a very high esprit de corps, in that they're very motivated. They get along well. They enjoy being part of that group. But if there's too much homogeneity of thought within the group and they're not getting actual viewpoints from a lot of different groups, then they often end up making worse decisions, or even, they not only make bad ethical decisions, but they don't even realize there might be something problematic about what they're doing. So yeah, they have blind spots, essentially, and there are ways to fight that. So I talk about, using psychology to fight some of the bad tendencies.
Yeah, well, one thing your book does well, and your other books have done this too, is they present these stories. They really showcase science in a light that it is. It's not binary. I think too often science, kind of like the nature of a textbook in units and things like that, science can be presented as the answer is this and not this, and it's black and white, and it's not black and white. We see that in our local news about stories about public health and things like that. That it's a progression. We learn more. We were dead wrong, 3 months ago, and now we have to make a change, and that's, I think, what we. I feel like there's growth there that could be done to kind of showcase that more, that it is always a process.
Yeah, actually, that's a very good point, in that we do expect a lot of times scientists to give us answers. And it's kind of comforting in ways when we feel like we have a nice, solid answer about something. But you're right. Science is more of I think about science as two things, actually. One, it is a body of knowledge and facts in some ways, but in other ways, it is a process, just like you said, where we need to be sort of reiterating, looking at things another way, taking a closer look at them, adding subtlety, or in some cases, when better evidence comes up, even changing our mind. So that process is really important, and I understand it can be frustrating for people on the outside when they think people are just changing their minds all the time. But there is a reason that they're doing that. And if we looked at some of these cases, we would have a better idea of why people change their mind, and that it is a natural part of science.
Yes.
Sam, have you had any pushback from the book? And I'm thinking like, well, do you have anyone saying, no, Edison's a saint and we go forward? And one reason I ask is that, and I noticed that you had your footnotes at the end of each chapter instead of the end of the book, and I'm wondering if you felt pressure to put more evidence up front.
No, the footnote thing was not for that reason. I have definitely had people complain about the footnotes in the past, about how they didn't. There were end notes technically, and that you had to flip to the end of the book.
Okay.
Instead of now that they're footnotes, so that you can actually see them on the page. So I was happy to make that change. I think it works better when they're on the page. But I haven't had any feedback about the Edison story, the animal cruelty story that you were alluding to. I have had more feedback, people just saying, oh, why didn't you include this story or that story or something like that? And in some cases, there were things I'd talked about in other books, didn't want to revisit them, or things that I think have been written about a lot that I felt like have been covered in other cases. So different reasons I didn't include different stories. And, maybe if I were to do the book again, I would include them or not.
You can do a volume 2 and solicit, who's your favorite science jerk? And
I hope not. I don't want to do another. I hope there's not enough material for a sequel. And also, my other books were fun and lighthearted. And I think there are certain cases in this book, none of the ones we've talked about, obviously, but there are certain cases in this book where you have people, committing crimes against each other. And it's sort of this madcap, Wild West sort of situation where I think there's some humor in it. But this book was a bit darker than some of my other books, but it's kind of a true crime book. It has that sort of illicit thrill to it that you see sometimes with true crime, where people are committing murder, sabotage, things like that, espionage. And so it was a bit of a darker book in some ways.
Yeah. I work at two elementary school. Well, I work at a couple different elementary schools, but one is Columbus Elementary School and the other one is Edison Elementary School. Okay. And the Edison one's got the little wall of Edison, and his old pictures and all kinds of stuff like that.
With a happy little light bulb logo.
Yeah. And ever since I've learned more about Edison, there's times when I see that and I'm just like, you know.
I defended him a little bit in the book in that especially online, there's a view that Edison completely screwed over Nikola Tesla, kind of ruined his life, things like that. And I do think that is a bit unfair. I think Edison deserves a lot of credit for the work that he did do. He did help do some amazing things. It's just that there were some other things he did that aren't as well known that I think were kind of shameful. So,
yeah.
Well, Sam, before we let you go, we are talking to teachers and students that are thinking about maybe pursuing a science career. And you alluded a little bit to if your ethics are compromised, you're going to have bad science. And you mentioned, if you have a more homogeneous background, that might be a kind of a signal there. Are there other things that we should be aware of to avoid some of these dubious ethical kind of quandaries that a scientist might find themselves in? What are some takeaways?
I do talk a little bit about kind of in general the psychology of scientists who fall into this trap. I think one common thing is tunnel vision, where whatever they're focused on is the only thing they care about, and they don't really think about anything else beyond just getting the data, getting the experiment done, whatever it is they're trying to do. So I think that's probably the most common thing is tunnel vision. Just watch out if you're that focused, you're that obsessed with something. You have to look a little bit broader. There is more to the world than just getting this experiment done.
I can relate to that. Tunnel vision. Yeah. Just go down a rabbit hole of something and all of a sudden you're where'd all the time go?
Yeah. And again, tunnel vision can be a good thing sometimes, but there are other times, especially when you're dealing with human beings, where there are bigger issues out there.
Well, sometimes we celebrate that tunnel vision. We just watched Good Will Hunting with the kids last night. They were bored, but never mind that. There's a point where they're trying to get Matt Damon a job, and they're talking about, he'll be in a think tank where his mind is allowed to roam free. And, there's part of me that's like, well, is that always a good thing?
Yeah. Yeah, you end up with the unfettered imagination can go some bad places sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the last thing I do want to ask, just as to kind of get it on our minds here, you do mention kind of like the future. Where are some places where we might find where some of those rules might be bent the most in the future? And you kind of mentioned a few. Can you share a few of those areas with us, knowing that we have, again, students and teachers that are thinking about pursuing careers in these fields?
Yeah, at the end of the book, I add an appendix that's called, I think it's just called The Future of Crime, where I do talk about areas where in the future we might see more ethical issues arise. I focus specifically on genetic engineering, things like CRISPR or other technologies. I focus on computing and advanced artificial intelligence, things like that. And I focus on space, where we might see just new types of crimes arise because we're going into new environments, very harsh environments. We're going to be outside the jurisdiction of nations. We're going to have people, years away on Mars or whatever. How do we police that? What's going to happen there? So I think these are cases where new technologies could even give rise to whole new types of crime that we just don't have to face nowadays. And I think, again, that's sort of a fascinating idea, but hopefully by anticipating some of that, we're not going to eliminate all the problems, but maybe we can anticipate and at least try to minimize the problems that we will inevitably face.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Sam. We have enjoyed your books from the beginning, from The Disappearing Spoon. We've had guests on that have talked about. I've written this book in the style of The Disappearing Spoon, and so it's always a treat.
That's very flattering.
Yeah, it's always a treat to have you on and see what you're up to next. And we hope that your stories give some fodder for great conversations in the classroom.
I'd be very gratified to hear that if, you got students thinking about science in a different way and taking a critical eye to it and walking away with it for a better appreciation for what goes on. That would be very flattering.
Wonderful. Well, if you're listening, if you're a teacher and you've used some of Sam's work in the classroom, and you, especially with the Icepick Surgeon, please drop us a line and we'll make sure to get it on to Sam.
Thanks much, Sam.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Lab Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about some of the things discussed in this episode or previous episodes, you can find show notes at our website, laboutloud.com. If you have a guest idea or a future topic that you'd like to see on Lab Out Loud, go to our contact page and send us a message. Also, you can subscribe to Lab Out Loud on your favorite podcasting app, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to find podcasts. While you're there, leave us a review and rating. Your input helps others find our show. Thanks again for listening.